These two judgments give the thoughts of good and bad a content which is the opposite of what they had for us. But self-consciousness was at first only incompletely related to its objects, that is, only according to the criterion of being for self. Consciousness has equally, however, an intrinsic nature of its own, and must likewise make this aspect a criterion, and only when it has done this is the spiritual judgment complete. According to this aspect, the state power expresses its essence. This power is in part the established law, and in part government and command, which regulates the particular activities within the action of the whole. The one is the simple substance itself. The other is its action, which animates and sustains itself in everyone. The individual thus finds therein his ground and essence expressed, organized, and manifested. On the other hand, the individual, through the enjoyment of wealth, gains no experience of his universal nature, but only gets a transitory consciousness and enjoyment of himself qua single and independent individual, and of the disparity between himself and his essence. The notions of good and bad thus receive here a content which is the opposite of what they had before. Hegel begins paragraph 498 by noting that in the previous paragraph, 497, we had an important reversal between good and bad, so that the objects that we originally associated with them, or rather judged to those things to apply to, state power and wealth respectively. State power is good, wealth is bad, suddenly reversed, and wealth becomes good, state power becomes bad. And you can find out, why just by going back to that. But now we're going to have another reversal once again in this paragraph. So these are coming very fast on the heels of each other. And what's going on for consciousness is this sort of oscillation back and forth that's going to lead us somewhere else in just a few more paragraphs. But first, let's talk about why there's yet another reversal. So Hegel here is going to make the fundamental contrast between one way in which self-consciousness is understanding itself and the good and the bad and wealth and state power in relation to itself through making judgments, and another, in some respects, fuller or more adequate way. Interestingly, generally in Hegel, the movement tends to be from the in itself to the for itself, but here we see that what we've got is a movement from the for itself to the in itself as being more integrated, as being further along. So he begins by telling us that self-consciousness was only incompletely related to its objects. What were its objects? Both good and bad, or more concretely, wealth and state power. It was only incompletely related to them because it was relying upon, as Hegel is going to say, the criterion of being for itself. The criterion being the Maßstab, you might say ruler, or measure is another way of thinking about it, the way of figuring out how to apply these concepts of good and bad, what to bring under what heading. It was only doing so in an incomplete way, a way that made sense for it at the time. There's some things going for that criterion, but it's not as full, it's not as effective as it could or should be. So, what do we have coming in its place? Hegel tells us that now consciousness also has an intrinsic nature, an an sich, right? An sich sein of its own, and it must also make this aspect, the in itself, into a criterion, a Maßstab. So it has to measure things in two ways. And Hegel, by the way, here is not saying, oh, get rid of the first measure because the second one is so much better. And this makes good sense if we think about things dialectically. What do we want to do? We want, in order to understand something adequately, we don't want to just, get rid of one measure and throw it away forever and say we've moved on to something better and more complete. No, we keep both measures and we use them to get something almost like stereoscopic vision of the objects that we're looking at. That's what makes things more adequate. That is Aufhebung, or sublation, if you like, an integrative transcendence taking place. Now, Hegel tells us that when we do that, what we're going to find is going to put state power and wealth into different lights. Notice that what's going to happen here, we'll go back to the text in just a moment. Notice what's going to happen here is an internal development on the part of what's really involved in state power. It no longer becomes this monolithic, uniform mass that we find oppressive, that we don't have any place in. As a matter of fact, some of the things that we saw in wealth are going to turn out to be there in state power. So let's look at what Hegel says. He tells us that according to this aspect, state power expresses its essence. Okay, so that's nothing new, right? That he's been saying since the very beginning of introducing state power and wealth. State power expresses the essence of the individual. The question is, does it express the individuality of the individual at all? Or is this an essence that in a certain way oppresses it, dominates it, demands obedience from it? Is that all there is? So he tells us this power is in part the established law and in part government and command, which regulates the particular activities within the action of the whole. So now he's thinking about state power not just in terms of one single thing, but this is something that we saw playing out, by the way, in the discussion of human law earlier on in this spirit section, right? In the previous subsection of it. We have the established laws and maybe customs, and then we have the government, the thing that actually executes those, the thing that has to respond on the spot with perhaps some flexibility and remaining true to those. And now we have a dialectic going on between them. And this is what allows there to be, you might say, an adjustment to circumstances that might be able to take into account individuality. Previously, it was wealth that was seen as being so flexible that could take everybody into account and find a niche for each person and their own activity and their own desires, whereas state power was, it's there, it's kind of clunky, it's the essence, and, it just puts everybody into their place. Here, there's at least the prospect of something a bit more refined. So he says the one, by that he means the established law, is the simple substance itself. The other is its action, which animates and sustains itself, right? So far so good for state power. It sustains itself and everyone else. So the government, by being the government, is not just taking care of itself. I mean, there are governments that do that, right? Think it back to Aristotle and his distinction between, corrupt and true forms of government. What was the fundamental difference? It wasn't who was in charge. It was whose benefit were they ruling for? Was it primarily their own benefit or the benefit of their class or the benefit of those associated with them? Or did they take other people and indeed perhaps even the common good into account and treat them as important, as valued in the process? Well, you know the answer if you've read your Aristotle, and Hegel is saying that this is possible for at least some governments and the orientation of the individual in relation to the government. So he says the individual finds therein his ground and essence, the essence being the state power, expressed, organized, and manifested. There's the possibility of finding meaning, a home, community within state power, no longer just something that oppresses one, that tells you, no, you do it our way, but perhaps something that says, look, this is our way, and we do it this way because here's some reasons for it. Now, do you think you could possibly get on board? Or maybe we'll try to convince you a little bit more. You know, Hegel doesn't go into any great details about this, but that's what we're talking about here. Now, this could be purely imaginary. Maybe the individual is candy coating, as we say, a very, oppressive and exploitative regime, but Hegel doesn't say that either. He's holding out the possibility of something different. What does this do to wealth, then? Wealth was being construed as the good precisely because it provided what now it looks like is available on the side of the government. What does wealth provide us with? Well, we saw that the individual was not enabled to be recognized, not enabled to find him or herself in state power reflected, right? And they were in terms of wealth. But are they really? Hegel tells us here, he says, the individual, through the enjoyment of wealth, gains no experience of what? His own individual self? No, he does gain that, but he doesn't gain any experience of his universal nature. Only a transitory consciousness and enjoyment of himself qua single and independent individual. And he notices the difference, the disparity, the disjunction between his essential nature and his individual nature. This is why people can have that experience of surrounding themselves with all sorts of stuff and having tons of money in the bank and waking up one day and saying, wow, this is a lot of crap. What am I supposed to do with this? How does this actually give my life any significance? They may not actually turn to state power to find that. They may find it in other places, but that is an experience that people sometimes do have with wealth. What Hegel here is calling the distinction between their essential nature and their individuality, or if you like it, between himself and his essence. And so then Hegel says, look, the notions of good and bad receive a content which is the opposite of what they had before. So in the last paragraph, we saw that wealth became good, state power became bad. Now by the end of this paragraph, state power becomes good again, and wealth becomes bad again. But they become good and bad in different ways than they were before. And this is a point where we want to think about, the Hegelian dialectic. You could say, well, there's change polarity again. No, there was an advance that was made. There's a fuller understanding of what's going on, and we're using both of these criteria, the criteria of the being for itself and the criteria of the in itself. Each of these two ways of judging finds a likeness and a disparity. In the first case, consciousness judges the state power to be essentially different from it, and the enjoyment of wealth to accord with its own nature. While in the second case, it judges the state power to accord with its nature and the enjoyment of wealth to be essentially different from it. We have before us a twofold finding of likeness and a twofold finding of disparity. An antithetical relation between the two real essentialities. We must ourselves judge these different judgments and apply to them the criterion set up. According to this, the conscious relation which finds likeness is the good. That which finds disparity is the bad. And these two forms of the relation we are henceforth to hold fast as diverse shapes of consciousness. By forming diverse relationships, consciousness itself comes to be determined as diverse, being good or bad, not because it had for its principle either being for itself or pure being in itself, for both are equally essential moments. In the twofold judging considered above, the principles were thought of as separate and therefore contained merely abstract ways of judging. Actual consciousness has within it both principles, and the distinction between them falls solely within its own essence, that is, in the relation of itself to the actual. We reach a very important transition point here in paragraph 499, which Hegel is not going to make completely evident for us in its implications until the next paragraph, number 500, in which he's going to introduce these new terms, the noble and base consciousness. Now, we don't want to get distracted by that, endpoint, you might say, of at least that part of the process. But I do want to say where we're going with this, because it might be rather confusing given the way in which Hegel is structuring things. Or if you look at what I've got here on the chalkboard, we're already doing things here at a meta level, and there's all these different, not quite antitheses, but certainly oppositions that are taking place that we're transforming into other ones. But that's what's going on here in this paragraph. That's part of why it is so important. So Hegel tells us that what we've got on the table right now are two distinct ways of judging, of making judgments, urteilen, right? Of deciding things, bringing particular objects under concepts, or if you like, applying predicates to them. This is all stuff that we can understand in terms of, a traditional logic, but one in which Hegel is enfolding into a dialectical logic. So we have made judgments up until this point, or rather the consciousness that is trying to figure out where exactly it fits in has been making judgments about the good and the bad. And it's been making these in terms of these two polarities of wealth and state power. And we saw there was an important fluctuation that depending on which criterion we were operating with, which Maßstab, right, which measure, whether it's that of being in itself or being for itself, we were going to end up with different answers about which of these is the good and which of these is the bad. And so we saw them flip their positions around a bit. So Hegel is trying to put all of this together now at this point. And he tells us, in the first case, consciousness judges the state power to be essentially different from it, right? And what we've got here is like and different. Like is also translating, or is rendering the same thing as what we've got here as in accord with its nature. Hegel is using these two terms that he's been employing for a while now. Gleichheit, or gleich, similar, same, in this case, accordant with, right? Fitting in with, and Ungleichheit or ungleich, not being that, and being thereby different, right? So Hegel has said that at first what we were finding is that state power is different from us. It may be where our essence is, but we experience it as oppressive. It's got no room for individuality. It's just something that we are going to label as bad because it's essentially different. And we saw that this is how he's parsing these out. And many people do, in fact, think of bad as something different, good as something that's in accordance with us. This goes back a long, long ways. It's not just sort of ordinary person's conceptions that are rude and not very well refined. I mean, you see this also being appealed to necessarily in a lot of substantive, high-powered moral theories. You're going to see some discussions of this in the Stoics. You're going to see Thomas Aquinas talking in this way. Plato, Aristotle can't avoid this. Even Descartes, is going to use some of these things. It's kind of a common matter of recourse. So it's not actually a bad thing to do. What is the upshot here? So we started out with wealth as being something that is like us, or as he's saying, we see the enjoyment of wealth accords with our own nature, the nature of consciousness. Then we change our ordering of judgment here. It says in the second case, it judges the state power to accord with its nature, right? We found that the state power does have some room in it for individuality. As a matter of fact, it might be the locus in which we can express individuality. It says it accords with its nature, and the enjoyment of wealth winds up being essentially different, ungleich, from it, right? So in one way of judging, we have one thing being good and the other being bad. In another way of judging, we reverse those, and the thing that was good becomes bad, and the thing that was bad becomes good. So what are we supposed to do with this? So do we just throw our hands up in confusion? Oh, it just all depends on our perspective, Crazy stuff. We don't know what to apply good and bad to. Is that what Hegel says? No. And that's not what we do in practice either. I mean, some people do. This is a little bit of a side note. Oftentimes when people get all relativistic on you, there's a couple reasons for it. It could be because that's what they feel that they ought to do, right? They're so afraid of taking a stand, making a judgment, that they engage in this relativistic, I don't really know, I can't, who's to say from this perspective, from that perspective, right? And those people are essentially prisoners of relativism. They're not happy because of it most of the time. They'd love to actually be able to say that something is right and something is wrong, but they've just been so terrorized or, shamed or whatever, conditioned into thinking that that's the way you got to talk if you're going to fit into modern society, that's what they do. And they're not happy doing it. The other people who often talk as relativists are the people who are trying to get over on you, right? It's when somebody wants to swindle you or get something over on you or tell you that there's an exception to be made here, that they start playing fast and loose with good and bad and, who knows? Nobody really can be quite sure. It's all a gray area or any of that sort of nonsense. There's really a wonderful scene, as a bit of a digression, in a movie, The Man Who Never Was, where you see this character who is up for a murder charge. His attorney comes in and, does that song and dance about, well, can we really trust any perspectives? Nobody really knows what good or bad is. Just and unjust, innocent, guilty. Who actually can say for certain? And he gets a mistrial. And, it looks like he's gotten off, but of course they're going to try him again. And this time he doesn't have any money for the attorney to do the relativistic dance. And he goes to prison. If I remember right, goes and gets executed as well. And the reason is because it doesn't have anybody to do that sort of song and dance, as I said, that shtick anymore. So Hegel doesn't do that. Hegel's interested in figuring out what the hell is good and bad, right? And so is consciousness. Consciousness is trying to figure out, where should I be putting my moral eggs? This basket or this basket? Where do I put them? So how can it figure that out? Well, Hegel says what we've got here is a twofold finding of likeness, Gleichfinden, and a twofold finding of disparity, an antithetical relation between the two real essentialities. We're in a pickle, to put it lightly, right? He says, here's where we make a new step. We must ourselves judge these different judgments and apply to them the criterion set up. We can realize that the reason why we're in this predicament is because we have conflicting judgments, and we need to think our way through them using the criteria that we, in fact, developed. This is where we assert the power of consciousness, not the paralysis of relativism. So what do? We judge the judgments. Hegel says that we go on, and he says, according to this, the conscious relation which finds likeness is the good. The conscious relation. The good is no longer now in the object, wealth or state power. The good is in the consciousness and the judgment that it's making. So this now becomes good. And this now becomes bad. And it's the consciousness itself which is good or bad, depending on how it is judging things. Does the consciousness find within itself, in relation to those things, state, power, and wealth, likeness? If it does, it is thereby good. Does it find instead unlikeness? Does it emphasize the unlikeness? That is a bad consciousness. So he goes on and he says, the consciousness which finds likeness is the good. That which finds disparity is the bad. These two forms of the relation we are henceforth to hold fast as diverse forms of consciousness. The good and the bad no longer lie in the objects, but within ourselves, the observer, the judger, the orienting ourselves in relation to these things being, the moral being. What does this imply? This implies that in the very act of making moral judgments, we ourselves become good or bad by doing that. Now, isn't that fascinating? Maybe there's a good way and a bad way of making moral judgments. This sounds, as I said, very meta, doesn't it? We're now doing things on a higher level. And that's exactly what the Hegelian dialectic does. It takes something from a lower level and brings it up. It integrates it into a higher level. That is what sublation or Aufhebung is. That is how the dialectic advances. This is how moral consciousness develops in time, in history. So he says, by forming diverse relationships, consciousness itself comes to be determined as diverse, as being itself good or bad. Not because it had for its principle either being for itself or pure being in itself. Both of these are essential moments. If you remember a few paragraphs back, again, in terms of sublation, I said that what we wanted to develop is a kind of stereoscopic vision where we're able to see things from multiple perspectives at the same time so as better to understand the objects, in this case, the essentialities of wealth and state power that we were attempting to make sense of. But we're also doing that in relation to our own being as moral agents, as judgers, as evaluators. So he goes on and he says, in the twofold judging considered above, the principles were thought of as separate, and therefore contain merely abstract ways of judging. But actual consciousness has within it both principles. This is what makes moral judgment difficult to do, but also makes it real. The fact that it's not merely abstract. Hegel is attuned to the fact that genuine moral consciousness is going to contain both sides within it. So he says the distinction between them falls solely within its own essence, that is, in the relation of itself to the actual, the consciousness to its objects. So where are we going to go from here? We're going to find the good and bad no longer, as I said, in these objects, which we have all these relations of judgment to. Those don't go away, but precisely in the consciousness itself, aware of these, likenesses, unlikenesses, aware of the fact that it engages in judgment, in the fact that it can judge its own judgments and thereby judge itself.